The sun was shining bright over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the busy streets below. It was the middle of the 1990s, a time when action movies were ruling the world and cinema was going through a massive shift. For Keanu Reeves, life had moved fast, very fast. Just a short while ago, he was mostly known as the goofy guy from the comedy Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure but now, he was one of the biggest action stars on the planet. The movie Speed had changed everything for him. It was a massive global hit, full of explosions and adrenaline, and it made Hollywood realize that Keanu wasn't just a funny sidekick. He was a serious leading man who could carry a blockbuster on his shoulders. Because of this sudden explosion of fame, everyone wanted a piece of him. Studio executives were constantly calling, agents were scheduling back-to-back meetings, and scripts were piling up high at his front door. But amidst all this chaos and noise, Keanu remained a surprisingly calm and private person. He didn't care much about the glitz, the glamour, or the fancy parties that came with being a movie star. He preferred riding his motorcycle through the city traffic, playing in his grunge band, and finding good stories that actually meant something to him. He wasn't driven by money, which was something that the big bosses in Hollywood found very hard to understand. On this particular afternoon, the air was hot and dry as Keanu rode his motorcycle up to the gates of a major movie studio. The security guards recognized him immediately and waved him through without checking his ID. He parked his bike near the entrance and took off his helmet, running a hand through his messy hair. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a flashy designer suit. He was dressed in his usual simple style comfortable clothes, maybe a light jacket, and boots that looked like they had seen some miles. He walked toward the tall, glass building that loomed ahead, which looked like a giant monument to money and power. Inside the building, the atmosphere was completely different from the sunny street outside. The air conditioning was cranked up high, making the offices feel cold and sterile. The floors were so shiny you could see your reflection in them. Keanu walked past rows of busy assistants typing furiously on computers and talking on phones. But he didn't look around. He knew exactly where he was going. He was there for a meeting with the head of the studio and a big-time producer. These were the people who controlled the millions of dollars, and they were used to getting exactly what they wanted, exactly when they wanted it. When he reached the heavy wooden doors of the main conference room, he paused for a second to take a breath. He could hear low, serious voices inside. He opened the door, and the conversation stopped instantly. Sitting at the far end of a long, expensive table were two men. One was the studio executive, a man with a stern face and a suit that looked like it cost more than most people's cars. The other was the producer, a man who talked fast and always seemed to be selling something. They stood up when Keanu entered, shaking his hand with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was the kind of smile sharks give you before they swim closer. "Keanu, glad you could make it," the executive said, his voice booming in the large room. "Please, have a seat." Keanu took a seat. The chair was made of soft black leather, but it felt uncomfortable. The room was too big, and the table felt like a battlefield. The two men sat down opposite him, and for a moment, nobody spoke. They just looked at him. They weren't looking at Keanu the human being. They were looking at a product that could make them incredibly rich. It was a feeling he had gotten used to over the years, but he never really liked it. He shifted in his chair, waiting for them to speak. So, the producer started, breaking the silence. "Let's get down to business. We are ready to move forward with the sequel. We know the timing is tight, but we want to lock you in. The fans love you, the critics love you, and we want to make a deal today." He pushed a thick stack of papers across the table toward Keanu. It was the contract. It was hundreds of pages long, filled with tiny legal language that only lawyers truly understood. But Keanu didn't need to read every word to know what it was about. It was about commitment. It was about locking him up for the next year of his life to make a movie that would make the studio a fortune. However, Keanu had hesitations. He had read the script the night before in his quiet apartment. To be honest, it wasn't very good. It was just noise and explosions. Without the heart that made the first movie special, he was also thinking about a small theater production in New York. He had promised a group of friends struggling, actors and directors, that he would perform with them. It wasn't for the money. It was for the love of acting and keeping his word to the people who knew him before he was famous. If he signed this contract, he would have to break that promise. He would have to let his friends down for a paycheck. The executive watched Keanu's face closely. He was a smart man who had been in the business for decades. He saw the hesitation in Keanu's eyes. He knew that actors often got cold feet when they saw the size of the commitment, or when they worried about their artistic integrity. But he also knew that money really solved those problems. He had a plan B, and he was ready to use it. "Look, Keanu," the executive said, leaning forward over the table. He reached under a stack of papers and pulled out a thick white envelope. He opened it slowly and slid something out that made the air in the room feel heavy. It was a check. Keanu looked down at it. The numbers were written in a bold, sharp font. It was a play or pay advance. This meant that even if the movie never got made because of weather problems or script issues, or if Keanu decided to walk away tomorrow, the money was his to keep. He could just take it and leave. The amount on the check was $10 million. $10 million. It was a crazy amount of money, especially back then. In the mid-90s, you could buy several huge mansions with that kind of cash. You could buy a private island. You could live for 10 lifetimes and never spend it all. The executive slid the check right next to Keanu's hand. It sat there on the dark mahogany table, white and crisp and demanding. It felt heavy, like a physical weight. "This is just the advance," the producer said quickly, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Once the movie is out, there will be back-end points, bonuses, merchandise. You're looking at the kind of money that sets you up for life, Keanu. All you have to do is sign right there on the dotted line. And this check is yours." The two men leaned back in their chairs. They were confident. They thought the game was already won. In their world, nobody turned down $10 million. It wasn't just money. It was power. It was security. They watched Keanu, waiting for his eyes to light up, waiting for him to grab the pen and start signing. They expected a smile, maybe a nod of agreement, or even a handshake. But Keanu just sat there. He looked at the check for a long moment, then he looked at the contract, and finally, he looked up at the two men watching him. He didn't look greedy. He didn't look scared of losing the money. He just looked calm. He picked up the pen, but he didn't open the contract to sign it. He tapped it gently against the table, thinking. The silence in the room grew louder, ticking away like a clock, as the weight of the decision hung in the air. The executive raised an eyebrow, sensing that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning unit hidden in the ceiling vent. The check sat on the table between them, gleaming under the lights. It was a physical object, just a piece of paper with ink on it. But in that room, it felt like a living, breathing thing. It was staring at Keanu, demanding his attention. The producer leaned back in his leather chair, looking completely sure of himself. He tapped his finger on the table, a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the ticking clock on the wall. "We don't need to overthink this, Keanu," the producer said, his voice smooth and confident. "This is a done deal. You sign, we announce the movie tomorrow, and you are set for life. $10 million, just for saying yes." Keanu looked down at the check again. He saw the zeros lined up in a row. It was a staggering amount of money. Most people would have grabbed the pen, signed their name, and run out of the room as fast as they could. But Keanu didn't move. He picked up the pen, but instead of opening the contract, he just turned it over and over in his fingers. He was thinking about the script he had read the night before. He had sat in his living room, reading the pages, waiting for the story to grab him, waiting for the character to feel real. But it never happened. The script was full of loud noises and big explosions, but the heart of the story was missing. It felt empty. He looked up at the executive, the man in the expensive suit who controlled the studio. "The script," Keanu started softly. I've read it 3 times now, and I have to be honest with you guys. It doesn't feel right. The story, it's confusing, and the character. He doesn't make sense to me. I don't know who he is." The executive let out a short, sharp laugh. He waved his hand in the air as if he were swatting away a fly. "The script. We can fix the script. We have 20 writers working on it right now. You want more drama? We'll add drama. You want more jokes? We'll add jokes. That's the easy part, Keanu. The hard part is getting the star, and we have the star right here." Keanu shook his head slowly. "It's not just the lines," he said. "It's the soul of the movie. If I do this, I have to spend 5 or 6 months of my life living in this world. I have to give 100% of myself to it. I can't do that if I don't believe in it." The producer leaned forward, his smile fading just a little. "Okay, I hear you. You're an artist. You care about the craft. That's great. That's why we want you. But let's look at the schedule. We need to start shooting in 3 weeks. It's going to be a long shoot. 5 months in Mexico. We need you locked in. We need to know you aren't going to walk away halfway through because you're bored or confused." That word, Mexico, hit Keanu hard. He sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the LA skyline. 5 months in Mexico. That meant being away from everything he loved. It meant no motorcycle rides through the canyons, no late nights at the dive bars with his band, and no privacy. But more importantly, it meant breaking a promise he had made to his friends. He had a commitment, a real commitment, to a small theater group in New York. These weren't movie stars. They were struggling actors, people who scraped by just to pay their rent. They were doing a play, a dark and difficult play that meant a lot to them. Keanu had promised them he would perform. He had given his word. He wasn't doing it for the money. He was doing it because he loved the work and he respected the people he was working with. If he took this movie deal, he would have to cancel on them. He would have to look his friends in the eye and tell them that a paycheck was more important than his word. "I can't do the 5 months," Keanu said, turning his attention back to the men at the table. "And I can't start in 3 weeks. I have a prior commitment, a play in New York. I gave them my word." The executive stared at him. For a second, he didn't blink. Then, he let out a sigh that sounded like he was exhausted. "Keanu, listen to me. You are thinking like a normal person. You are not a normal person anymore. You are a movie star. You don't do plays for pocket change. You do movies like this one, this play. These friends, they will understand. Tell them you got an offer for $10 million. They won't be mad. They'll be happy for you. They need me," Keanu said simply, "and I said I would be there. My word is all I have. If I break that for money, what kind of person am I?" The room went dead silent. The producer looked at the executive and then back at Keanu. The friendly mask was slipping off. Now they just looked annoyed. They were used to people wanting things from them. They were used to actors having demands, bigger trailers, better jets, more posters on the buses. But they weren't used to an actor turning down $10 million because of a promise to a theater group. "You are turning down $10 million for a play?" the producer asked, his voice rising slightly. "Are you serious? We are talking about generational wealth here. You buy the house, you buy the car, you take care of your family. You don't throw that away for your word." "I'm not throwing it away," Keanu replied. His voice was very quiet, but it was steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was just stating a fact. "I just can't take it. The script isn't ready. The schedule is impossible. And I won't break my promise to my friends in New York. So, I'm sorry, but I can't sign this." He gently pushed the thick contract back across the table. He didn't push the check, though. He left that right where it was. Sitting between them, the executive stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, making a harsh sound that echoed through the office. He walked over to the window and looked out, his hands clasped behind his back. He was trying to control his temper. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had offered a fortune, the highest offer of the year, and this kid was saying no because of a play. It was insulting. It felt like a slap in the face. "You're making a mistake, Keanu," the executive said, without turning around. "You think you're being noble. You're being foolish." This opportunity won't come around again. The phone stops ringing when you say no to money like this. Do you understand that? We can find another guy. There are 100 guys who want this role. We are offering you a gift, and you are spitting in our faces. Keanu stood up as well. He buttoned the top button of his jacket. He looked at the back of the executive's head. I'm not trying to spit in anyone's face, Keanu said. I'm just trying to be honest. I appreciate the offer. I really do. It's a lot of money. But it's not the right move for me. He looked at the producer. I should go. The producer didn't stand up. He just sat there, looking at the check. His face was red. He looked like he was holding back an explosion. He had spent weeks putting this deal together. He had convinced the studio board to approve the $10 million. He had looked like a genius until 5 minutes ago. Now, if Keanu walked out that door, the producer was going to look like a failure, and he hated failing. Sit down, the executive said. He turned around from the window. His face was cold, his eyes hard. We aren't done here. I think we are, Keanu said politely. I can't do the movie. You don't understand, the executive said, walking slowly back to the table. He stood over the chair he had been sitting in, looming over the room. You aren't leaving until we have a deal. You aren't leaving until you sign that paper. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It went from a business meeting to something much darker. The air felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The friendly gestures were gone. The fake smiles had vanished. Now, it was just power. They had the power of the money, and they were going to use it to crush him. They thought they could scare him. They thought that if they pushed hard enough, he would break. Keanu stood his ground. He didn't look scared. He just looked tired. He looked like a man who wanted to go home and ride his bike. He looked at the executive, waiting for what was going to happen next. The executive reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He lit one, taking a long drag, and blowing the smoke toward the ceiling. You think this is a joke? The executive asked, pointing a finger with a cigarette at Keanu. You think you can walk in here and waste my time? Do you know how much money is on that table? Yes, Keanu said. $10 million. Exactly, the executive snapped. So stop acting like a child. Pick up the pen? Keanu didn't move. He didn't pick up the pen. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, calm as a rock in a storm. He had made his decision. He wasn't going to be bullied. He wasn't going to be bought. He was ready to walk out the door and leave the $10 million behind. He had a feeling that things were about to get ugly, but he was ready for it. The air in the room had grown heavy and thick, like the feeling before a thunderstorm breaks. The executive stood by the window, his back turned to the room, finishing his cigarette. He flicked the ash into a potted plant with a careless flick of his wrist. He wasn't looking at Keanu, but the tension radiating off him was sharp and dangerous. The producer sat still at the table, his face flush red, staring daggers at the $10 million check. It was no longer a gift. It was a weapon that had failed to fire, and they were angry. Keanu remained standing, calm and quiet. He had learned a long time ago that in these moments, silence was better than arguing. If he shouted, it would just be noise. If he stayed calm, he could think clearly. He watched the smoke from the cigarette drift up toward the ceiling, waiting for the next move. He knew these men. He knew that they didn't like hearing the word no. They were used to buying whatever they wanted, whether it was a house, a car, or a person. The executive turned around slowly. He walked back to the table, his footsteps heavy on the carpet. He didn't sit down. He walked straight over to where the check lay next to the unsigned contract. He looked down at the paper, then up at Keanu. There was no friendliness left in his eyes now. It was a cold, hard stare, the kind a predator gives its prey before it strikes. You think this is a game? The executive asked, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can waltz in here, waste my time, and then just walk away? I offered you $10 million. $10 million, and you're telling me you'd rather go play dress-up in a dusty theater in New York. It's not about the dress-up, Keanu replied softly. It's about the work. I told you. I gave them my word. Your word. The executive laughed, but it was a harsh, barking sound. Nobody cares about your word, Keanu. They care about what you sell. They care about the tickets you sell. And I am offering you the chance to sell a lot of them. But you are too arrogant to take it, the producer chimed in, leaning forward with a sneer. You know what happens to actors who turn down deals like this? They disappear. The phone stops ringing. The scripts stop coming. You are writing a high right now, but it can end just like that. He snapped his fingers for emphasis. You will be a trivia question in 5 years. Remember that guy from the bus movie? Whatever happened to him? Keanu didn't flinch. He had heard these threats before in different forms. The industry ran on fear. They wanted you to be scared that you would lose everything so that you would do whatever they said. But Keanu wasn't scared of losing the money. He knew that he could live simply. He didn't need a mansion or a yacht. He just needed to be able to look at himself in the mirror in the morning. Maybe, Keanu said, shrugging his shoulders slightly, but I'd rather disappear doing something I believe in than become famous doing something I hate. The executive's face twitched. He didn't like being talked back to. He was the boss here. He held all the cards. He reached out and grabbed the check from the table. He held it up in front of Keanu's face, waving it back and forth like a fan. Look at this, the executive hissed. This is more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. This is freedom. This is power. And you are treating it like it's trash. You are looking at it like it's nothing. It's just paper, Keanu said simply. It doesn't mean anything to me if I can't take the job. The executive's eyes narrowed. He decided he was done playing nice. He decided he was going to teach this young actor a lesson. He was going to show him what happened when you walked away from a fortune. He wanted to see Keanu panic. He wanted to see the regret in his eyes. He wanted to see him beg for the check back. Just paper. The executive whispered, "Okay, if it's just paper, then you won't mind this." And then, with a sudden, violent motion, the executive took hold of the check with both hands. *RIP. The sound was sharp and loud, echoing through the silent, glass-walled room. Keanu watched as the executive tore the check straight down the middle. The two halves fluttered slightly as he held them up. The numbers, the signature, the bank logo all split perfectly down the center. Keanu didn't move. He didn't gasp. He just watched. The producer looked shocked for a moment, his eyes going wide. He hadn't expected the executive to actually destroy the deal. That was real money. But then, a small smile crept onto the producer's face. He understood the game now. This was psychological warfare. This was meant to break the actor's spirit. You think that's it? The executive asked, his voice rising. He threw the two halves onto the table and grabbed them again, piling them on top of each other. *RIP. He tore them again, turning the check into 4 pieces. Then again. *RIP 8 pieces. He tore the check with a frenzy, his knuckles white, breathing hard. Small pieces of confetti-like paper began to fall onto the dark mahogany table. $10 million was being destroyed right in front of Keanu's eyes, and the executive was loving every second of it. He wanted to see the pain on Keanu's face. He wanted to see the realization that he had just thrown away a life-changing fortune. There, the executive shouted, slamming the final shredded pieces down onto the table. He leaned over the table, getting right into Keanu's face, panting slightly from the exertion. It's gone. It's all gone. You just lost $10 million because you're stubborn. You just tore up your future. The executive pointed a shaking finger at the pile of white scraps. Look at it. That is what you did. That is your fault. You could have signed. You could have been rich. But now it's just trash. Just like your career is going to be if you walk out that door. The room was silent again, except for the executive's heavy breathing. The producer watched Keanu closely, waiting for the breakdown. They expected him to dive for the pieces, trying to tape them back together. They expected him to start shouting, or crying, or apologizing. They expected him to realize how powerless he really was. But Keanu just looked at the pile of torn paper. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sad. He actually looked a little bit sad for the executive, not for the money. He watched the last piece of paper settle on the table. It was a strange moment. The most money ever offered to him was now nothing more than garbage on a desk. and the world hadn't ended. The sun was still shining outside. The birds were still flying. Keanu was still Keanu. He looked up from the mess and met the executive's angry stare. The executive was seething, waiting for a reaction, demanding a reaction. He looked like he had just won a war, but he was confused because the other side wasn't surrendering. Keanu took a deep breath. He didn't look at the shreds of the check. He looked straight into the eyes of the man who had just tried to humiliate him. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet, steady resolve that unsettled the older man even more than shouting would have. "Are you done?" Keanu asked, his voice incredibly soft. The executive blinked, stunned by the question. "Am I what? Are you done tearing up the paper?" Keanu asked. He gestured gently toward the mess on the table. "Because if you are, I really should be going. I have a rehearsal to get to." The words hit the executive like a bucket of ice water. He had just destroyed a fortune, thrown a tantrum like a toddler, and Keanu was worried about being late for a cheap theater rehearsal. The power move had failed completely. The check was gone, but Keanu's dignity was still intact. In fact, he looked more dignified than ever, standing there tall and calm amidst the ruins of the deal. You don't care," the producer stammered, speaking for the first time in minutes. "He just tore up $10 million. He tore up a piece of paper." Keanu corrected him gently. He buttoned his jacket, getting ready to leave. "The money was never real to me because I was never going to take it." "You can't lose what you never reached for." Keanu stood there, ready to walk out, leaving the two powerful men alone with their pile of shredded paper. They had tried to buy him, and when that didn't work, they tried to scare him. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that the man standing in front of them valued his peace of mind more than all the money in the world. He waited for a second to see if they had anything else to say, ready to handle whatever came next with the same calm he had shown so far. The silence that followed the tearing of the check was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes after a gunshot. It was the awkward, confused silence of people realizing that the script they had rehearsed in their heads was not playing out in real life. The executive stood there, his chest heaving slightly from the sudden burst of anger. He stared at Keanu, his eyes wide and intense, searching for even a tiny crack in the actor's armor. He was waiting for the panic to set in. He expected Keanu to look at the pile of shredded paper on the table, his face to go pale, and his hands to start shaking. He expected him to say, "Wait, stop, let's talk about this." But Keanu did none of those things. Instead, Keanu just stood there, looking at the mess on the table with a quiet sense of detachment. It was as if he were watching a scene from a movie he wasn't starring in. He didn't look angry. He didn't look insulted. In fact, he looked almost peaceful. The tension that had been filling the room seemed to bounce off him. He took a slow, deep breath, the kind of breath you take when you are standing on top of a mountain and looking at the view. The producer sat back in his chair, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the executive, then at Keanu, and then back at the white scraps of paper. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Just moments ago, the two men in the suits held all the power. They had the money, the studio, and the leverage. But by destroying the check in a fit of rage, the executive had given away his power. He had shown that he was emotional, volatile, and weak, and by staying calm, Keanu had shown that he was the strongest person in the room. Double quotes the executive started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure and his air of authority. "You really don't care, do you? I just tore up $10 million. I destroyed your future, and you're acting like it's nothing." Keanu finally looked away from the table and met the executive's gaze. His eyes were soft but serious. "It wasn't my future," Keanu said gently. "It was just a lot of money for a movie I didn't want to make. Tearing up the check didn't change the script. It didn't make the story better, and it didn't change my schedule." He gestured slightly toward the door. "I still have a promise to keep in New York. So, honestly, tearing up the check thus saved us some time. Now we don't have to pretend anymore." The executive let out a short, baffled laugh. He couldn't comprehend it. In his world, money was the most important thing. It was how you kept score. It was how you won. The idea that someone would turn his back on that kind of wealth over a simple promise was foreign to him. He looked at Keanu like he was an alien species. "You are a fool," the executive said, shaking his head. "A complete and utter fool. You could have owned this town." "I don't want to own the town," Keanu replied. He reached down and picked up his helmet, which he had placed on the floor near his feet. "I just want to do good work and be a good person. That's all." He turned toward the producer. "It was good to meet you. I'm sorry it didn't work out." The producer didn't say a word. He just nodded stiffly, his face still red. He was embarrassed by his boss's outburst, but he was also humbled by Keanu's reaction. He knew in that moment that he would never meet another actor like this. Keanu didn't play by Hollywood rules because he didn't care about the prize. He was walking away from the game while he was winning. Keanu walked toward the large wooden door. His footsteps were quiet on the thick carpet. He didn't look back at the shredded check. He didn't look back at the angry men. He moved with a natural grace, a fluidity that made him look like he was gliding rather than walking. He reached for the door handle, his hand steady. "Keanu," the executive called out one last time. Keanu paused, his hand on the handle, but he didn't turn around. "If you walk out that door, that's it. You're done here. We will never do business with you again." Keanu stood there for a second. The silence stretched out. Then he turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder. "I know," he said softly. "Have a good afternoon." And with that, he pushed the heavy door open and stepped out of the office. The instant the door clicked shut behind him, the atmosphere changed. The cold, tense air of the conference room was gone, replaced by the faint buzz of the outer office. Assistants were typing on phones, printers were whirring, and muted conversations were happening in cubicles. It was the real world. The world where people worked hard and didn't tear up million-dollar checks for fun. Keanu walked past the reception desk. The secretary looked up at him, surprised to see him leaving so soon. She knew about the big meeting. She knew about the massive offer. She expected him to come out looking excited, maybe holding a signed contract. Instead, he just looked like a guy who had finished a chore and was glad to be going home. "Have a good day, ma'am," Keanu said, giving her a small, polite nod. "You. You too, Mr. Reeves," she stammered, watching him walk toward the elevator banks. He pressed the button for the elevator. As he stood there waiting, he let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for the entire meeting. He felt light. He felt free. He realized that for the last hour, he had been carrying the weight of their expectations, their greed, and their anger. Now, he was leaving it all behind them. The elevator doors dinged and slid open smoothly. He stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, he caught a glimpse of himself in the polished metal walls of the elevator. He looked the same as he did when he walked in. He didn't look richer, and he didn't look poorer. He just looked like himself. The ride down was smooth and quiet. He thought about the pile of paper on the executive's desk. $10 million. It was a surreal amount of money. He wondered, just for a second, what it would have been like to take it. He thought about the houses he could buy, the cars he could drive. But then he thought about the script he would have to say the words for. He thought about the long months of filming a movie he didn't believe in. And most of all, he thought about his friends in New York, waiting for him to show up at the small theater. He smiled to himself. He knew he had made the right choice. The executive wanted him to feel like he lost something. But standing there in the descending elevator, Keanu felt like he was the only one who had won. He had his integrity. He had his freedom. And he still had his word. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened, letting in the bright California sunlight that poured through the glass front doors of the building. Keanu walked out of the shadow of the office tower and into the light. The air was warm, and the sounds of the city traffic, distant sirens, people chatting filled his ears. It was the sound of life. He walked to the parking lot where he had left his motorcycle. He saw it parked there, dusty and real. It wasn't a fancy sports car, but it was his. It took him where he wanted to go. He put on his helmet, zipped up his jacket, and swung his leg over the bike. He sat there for a moment, just looking at the world around him. People were rushing past, busy with their lives, worrying about their own problems. None of them knew that inside that tall building, a man had just torn up $10 million, and none of them would care. The world kept spinning, the sun kept shining, and Keanu was just happy to be a part of it, free to ride wherever he wanted, without a heavy check weighing him down. The engine of the motorcycle roared to life, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through Keanu's chest. It was a sharp contrast to the silent, air-conditioned tomb he had just left inside the studio building. He pulled his gloves on, tightening the Velcro straps around his wrists, and took one last look at the tall glass tower reflecting the bright afternoon sun. Somewhere up there, in that fancy office, two powerful men were probably sweeping a pile of shredded paper into the trash can, angry and confused. But down here on the street, the world was alive and moving. Keanu kicked the stand-up and twisted the throttle. The bike surged forward, merging into the flow of traffic on the busy Los Angeles street. The wind hit his face instantly, rushing past the helmet, blowing away the smell of expensive cologne and stale office air. It felt clean. It felt real. As he rode, the tension of the meeting began to fade from his shoulders. He didn't feel like he had lost something. He felt like he had dodged a bullet. He had walked away from a trap made of gold, and now he was free. He rode for a long time, taking the long way home, winding through the hills and letting the noise of the engine clear his mind. He wasn't thinking about the $10 million. He was thinking about the theater in New York. He was thinking about the script they were working on, a play that was raw and difficult and beautiful. He was thinking about his friends, the ones who weren't movie stars, the ones who were struggling to pay rent, but who poured their hearts into their art every single night. He had made a promise to them, and today, he had kept it. That felt better than any bank balance could ever feel. A few weeks later, Keanu was in New York City. The weather was cold and gray, a stark difference from the California sunshine. He wasn't staying in a penthouse suite or a luxury hotel. Instead, he was crashing on a friend's couch, sleeping in a spare room with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. There was no private chef, no limousine waiting outside, and certainly no $10 million checks lying around. Every morning, he would wake up, put on a coat and a hat to avoid being recognized, and walk to the small, run-down theater where the play was being rehearsed. The floors were squeaky, and the heating didn't always work properly. There was no craft services table with gourmet snacks, just a pot of old coffee and a box of donuts someone brought in. But the energy in the room was electric. When Keanu walked in, nobody treated him like a superstar. He was just Keanu, one of the actors. He carried props, helped move scenery, and spent hours dissecting lines with the director. They worked late into the night, their voices echoing off the empty seats. They weren't doing it for money. They were doing it because they loved the story. They were doing it for the feeling of connecting with an audience, of telling a truth that mattered. Keanu looked happier than he had looked in that studio office. He was tired. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his clothes were wrinkled. But he had a light in his eyes that money couldn't buy. Back in Hollywood, the story of what happened in the conference room began to spread. The executive and the producer couldn't keep it quiet. They told people the story, expecting everyone to laugh at the crazy actor who turned down a fortune. They told it as a warning to other young actors. Asterisk, don't be stupid. Don't think you are bigger than the business. Asterisk, but something strange happened when the story got out. Instead of laughing at Keanu, people respected him. Other actors heard it and shook their heads in amazement. Agents and directors heard it and saw him in a new light. In a town famous for fake smiles and greed, here was a man who had stood up to the biggest bullies and said no. He had proven that he couldn't be bought. He had values that were stronger than a stack of cash. The executives who had torn up the check eventually moved on to other projects. They found other actors who would take the money and do whatever they were told. Those movies made money, sure, but they were forgotten quickly. They didn't have a soul. Meanwhile, Keanu's reputation began to change. He wasn't just the guy from asterisk speed asterisk anymore. He was seen as a man of integrity, someone you could trust. Directors wanted to work with him not just because he was famous, but because he was real. This moment of saying no to the easy money opened the door for something much bigger. A few years later, a script came across his desk for a strange sci-fi movie called The Matrix. The studio wasn't sure about it. It was complicated, weird, and risky. They didn't want to pay the huge budget needed to make the special effects look good. But Keanu believed in it. He saw the potential. He remembered how he felt turning down the $10 million, the feeling of sticking to his gut, and he did it again. He agreed to star in the movie, but to make sure the studio could afford to make it right, he took a pay cut. He gave up millions of dollars in upfront fees so the money could go into the movie's effects. He did the exact opposite of what the greedy executives would have done. The Matrix became a massive global phenomenon. It changed cinema forever. It made hundreds of millions of dollars, and it turned Keanu into a legend. But he didn't do it for the money. He did it because he loved the project, just like he loved that small play in New York. The $10 million he lost that day in the office didn't matter anymore, because he had earned something far more valuable, a career built on respect and artistic freedom. Years later, people still tell the story of the torn check. It has become a Hollywood legend, a myth told in green rooms and on movie sets. But for Keanu, it was never about making a statement. It was just about living with himself. He didn't want to be the guy who sold his soul for a paycheck. He wanted to be the guy who could look in the mirror and sleep soundly at night. As the sun sets on the city and the lights of the theaters and billboards flicker on, Keanu is often seen simply walking the streets or riding his bike. He doesn't act like a king. He acts like a regular person. He stops to help people with car trouble. He gives up his seat on the subway. He lives simply, treating everyone he meets with the same kindness he showed to his friends in New York. The check is long gone, turned to dust in a landfill somewhere. The executive who tore it up is likely forgotten, just another suit in a long line of suits. But the story of what happened that day remains. It serves as a reminder to everyone that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't in your bank account, it's in your ability to walk away from the wrong thing, so you can run toward the right thing. And for Keanu Reeves, that peace of mind is the only fortune he ever really needed.